crafting a story, perhaps the hardest part is to keep all the pieces together and lead appropriately into a satisfying climax. You start out having all these ideas you'd like to do, you fit them in the story where you can, and you may find that you have to revise like crazy to make it cohesive. In filmmaking, it's even trickier because you usually tackle all 3 films in a trilogy separately. You can't go back and change a film drastically once it's released because you have these great ideas without essentially remaking it. You focus your attention on one at a time to make it the very best chapter you can. But if you are planning on a trilogy, you should keep in mind the end goal so you can naturally build towards it. For George Lucas, the ending of the Star Wars saga was always good triumphing over evil, but when that ending happened was in flux. He kept going back and forth between how many films he'd ultimately end up doing. First it was 3, then 9, then 6, and then there was even talk of 12 films at one point. The plan for 9 films was in place for quite some time, a lot of that during the making of Episode 5. Outside forces may have ultimately forced his hand to end that story early. Despite the record-breaking success of The Empire Strikes Back, the post-release was filled with chaos behind the scenes, leading to the departures of several key people. Producer Gary Kurtz was one of these, as he had been clashing with Lucas over several issues, such as the direction Lucasfilm was heading in and some production problems that arose during Empire. Alan Ladd Jr., Lucas's most vocal supporter at 20th Century Fox, quit the studio after Empire. Irvin Kershner declined to direct the next film. Ralph McQuarrie departed during the early production stages of the 3rd film. And Lucas's personal life was getting more fraught with problems in his marriage to Marcia, as she wanted him to commit more to raising their family that he had promised to have with her than overworking himself at his company. But perhaps the most significant fallout happened when Lucas left the Directors Guild of America, the Writers Guild, and the Motion Picture Association. This was in part due to a $25,000 fine the DGA imposed on Kershner and a further $250,000 fine from both the DGA and WGA on Lucas. The key issue was that The Empire Strikes Back didn't include an Irvin Kershner film credit at the beginning, which was against regulations. This rule clashed with the stylized, dramatic opening Lucas wanted for the series, and the guilds allowed it for the first film since Lucas's name appeared in the Lucasfilm credit and he was director for that film. But for the second film, the DGA was so incensed by this that they even tried pulling Empire from theaters. Lucas personally paid all the fines to the guilds, but the experience left him bitter enough to just take his leave of organized Hollywood. Departure was a double-edged sword, as while he now had more creative freedom to make movies his way, he couldn't just hire whatever director he wanted for the next film, and so had to look outside the professional organizations. With all this in place, not to mention the frustration that usually comes from having to make a Star Wars film, it's perhaps no surprise that Lucas chose to drop the sequel trilogy from his plans. He had done enough work on the backstory to keep him interested in the prequel trilogy, and he had also kind of soft-committed himself to making it when he named Empire Episode 5. But in writing Episode 6, some of the plans he had for the sequels either had to be moved up or canceled outright. The plan for the 9-film saga was to have Luke's sister be revealed in the sequels and play a major part. Darth Vader was going to die in Episode 6, leaving the big villain slot to be filled by the Emperor for the next 3 films. Well, moving up the Emperor's reveal and death was easy enough. The sister presented a big problem, though, as she was to be the other mentioned by Yoda in Episode 5. Lucas had to wrap this plot point up, but he realized that introducing a pivotal new hero character now was not ideal, since it would take additional screen time and scenes away from his established cast. So he looked to consolidate and settled on Leia to fulfill the other role. Once Lucas finished writing his draft, he convinced Lawrence Kasdan to come back in and work on the script. He chose Richard Marquand to direct the film, mostly because he was outside the DGA. A theory has cropped up that Lucas hired him because he realized Marquand was amenable to making the 3rd film the way Lucas wanted it versus making it his own way. This has been suggested as the reason that Lucas's first choices of David Lynch and David Cronenberg declined his offer to direct. There was still even more drama during the production of Episode 6. Disagreements on the script cropped up, like what to do with Han Solo, the Ewoks, and the second Death Star being used instead of a new location for the climax. Marquand's inexperience with special effects and the size of this picture meant Lucas was on set far more frequently than before, leading to accusations that he was essentially ghost directing the film. Like on Empire, Lucas was self-financing the film, and once again, the budget rose substantially. There was even a minor issue with the title of the film. Lucas started out wanting Return of the Jedi. It was changed to Revenge of the Jedi. The production used a false title of Blue Harvest for production purposes, and then after the marketing started, Lucas went back to the original title. Return of the Jedi's release was a bittersweet one. The trilogy was over, and box office numbers were quite strong. The audience seemed to like the picture fine, though there was a shared sentiment that it was the weakest of the three. The professional reviews were far more mixed. There was a lot of love going around, but there was also a fair share of disappointment. Rotten Tomatoes eventually did an experiment, compiling all the contemporary professional reviews of each of Lucas's 6 Star Wars films and seeing what the overall approval percentage was for each, eliminating the retrospective and fan reviews. The result was that of the 6 films, Return of the Jedi had the lowest approval rating at 31%. This seems quite shocking, given the film's stature in the fandom now, and the fact that all 3 of the original trilogy films have been selected for preservation by the Library of Congress. In any event, the conflicts during the making of Episode 6, Lucas's subsequent divorce, the rather shaky financial state of Lucasfilm after 1983, and the fact that Lucas kept having to compromise his creative vision due to the current state of filming technology, left him feeling burned out, and he would put his plans for the prequels on hold until the 1990s. So until 2015, Return of the Jedi was the official end to this story. The Empire is secretly constructing a second armored space station to replace the original Death Star. Due to wanting to see the space station finished and sensing the conflict within Darth Vader after his confrontation with his son, the Emperor oversees the project personally. Meanwhile, Luke Skywalker and his friends head to Tatooine, enacting an elaborate plan to free Han Solo from Jabba the Hutt. Upon their success, Luke splits from the group to reunite with Yoda on Dagobah to continue his Jedi training. However, Yoda is on his deathbed and tells Luke his final test will be confronting Vader again. Luke confirms with Yoda and Obi-Wan Kenobi that Vader is indeed his father, as well as learning about his twin sister, which Luke deduces to be Leia. In turn, Obi-Wan warns Luke of the danger awaiting him in his future confrontation, and his desire to redeem his father may be a bridge too far. It soon becomes clear that, for better or for worse, the Rebel attack on the second Death Star will be the beginning of the end of the Galactic Civil War, and that Luke's battle with his father will determine the course of the galaxy. Growing up, I was exposed to all 3 films of the original trilogy at the same time, so I never really questioned any of the story points or creative choices. It was all just one big story to me, and because I didn't have time in between entries to speculate on where the story could go, I just accepted it as is. Return of the Jedi is also special to me because it's the first one I have any distinct memory of watching. I did experience the films after the release of the special edition, so this was also the first one where I became aware of the different versions. The Jedi Rock sequence was the most notable change to my 5-year-old mind. Today, this is a clear entry in my top 5 of the series, and it's often number 3. I like it a lot, but I do recognize some of its lesser aspects and in fact share in a few of the common criticisms, as well as my own personal nitpicks and issues. That said, this still remains a special movie to me and my family. What drew me in here was the sense of optimism in Luke's quest to bring his father back, the spectacular final battle around the Death Star, and I've always had a thing for forest environments. Luke is the emotional center of this trilogy. The first film was a coming-of-age story, the second was a descent into hell, and the third is the final test of his convictions. So naturally the hero should be at his most confident and capable. We're not told how Luke has progressed from where he was at the end of Empire to where he is now with his Force skills without a master for guidance, but it's not really that important, and it's quite satisfying to see Luke overcome his disbelief in the power of the Force from the last film. He is surrendering himself to the Force and working with it as a true companion, just as a Jedi should. Yet he is still recognizably that same farm boy we started with. Luke still possesses a sense of naivety and a hopeful idealism about bringing his father back from the dark side, but it's endearing and ultimately proves justified. He does manage to resurrect the good within Anakin to overthrow his master and renounce the dark side. This isn't a full atonement for Vader's actions. Rather, it's proof that no man is trapped by the decisions of the past. People have an extraordinary capacity for change, and despite Obi-Wan's cautions and belief to the contrary, the good man that was Anakin Skywalker was never truly dead. In truth, Darth Vader was a smaller player in the original film and was intended to be so throughout the films, but he became so large in popularity that Lucas recognized that more needed to be done with him. In Empire, he was obsessed with finding Luke and bringing him over to his side. The ending of the last film has put Vader into something of a stupor. Luke was offered full power to control his destiny and shape the galaxy to his whims. He was offered family, he was offered a way to end the galactic violence, pretty much everything that Anakin sought after. And yet Luke rejects Vader's offer. This act is so profoundly moving to Vader that he's plagued with doubt. Is the dark side really the only answer towards mastering his fate as he thought in his youth? If his own son couldn't be made to see things his way, what does that say about him? And yet one act alone is not enough to resurrect Anakin Skywalker. He has pursued this path for so long that the dark side has a strong dominion over him. He feels bound to it because it's all he had left after he destroyed his own world in pursuit of power. In order for Anakin to come back, he must see that the dark side is insidious in its devilish hunger for the soul, and that the price is too high for a facsimile of true peace. This opportunity for change comes when Luke surrenders himself. Before the Emperor, he is once again offered power. He's given the same choice he had in Empire, with the added incentive of immediate consequences. If he refuses, his friends will die. Luke's greatest strength and weakness is his love for his friends, and he would only ever consider the dark side as a way to save them. This, of course, echoes the original motivation for Anakin's turn in Episode 3. Both Palpatine and Vader play on this motivation, and they come close to succeeding. Luke lashes out in a rage and defeats Vader in a lightsaber duel, cutting off his hand. When the time comes to make a choice, Luke sees his own artificial hand, the reminder of what giving in to his impulses did. In Empire, he made the mistake of rushing headlong to save his friends whatever the cost, and he paid that heavy price. Seeing the severed artificial hand of his father, notably given to him as a consequence of his own impulsiveness, Luke snaps back to reality. He throws the lightsaber away, rejecting aggressive violence and following the path of a true Jedi. This awakens something in Vader. His son has repeatedly demonstrated that the dark side's seduction is not complete and can be resisted. Inspired, he throws Palpatine over the edge and is mortally wounded in the process. But in so doing, he not only validates his son's faith in him, but he unknowingly confirms Padme's dying belief that there was still good in him. This is mostly fantastic stuff, and it's the reason why this lightsaber fight is my favorite of any of the films. However, I have a couple of minor issues with the end of this arc. I'm not too keen on Anakin returning as a Force ghost at the end, especially after witnessing all the evil he has done in the prequels, TV shows, video games, comics, whatever. The Emperor may be the epitome of true evil, but Vader was also a monster in the truest sense. Because Anakin made a series of bad choices, Vader was born out of the ashes. And so I would figure Anakin would still have a long way to go to achieve the privilege of being a Force ghost, never mind that it was apparently something that must be learned. At the same time, I get what Lucas was going for. It would put a bit of a damper on the happy ending of this trilogy if Luke only saw Obi-Wan and Yoda at the end. These three figures have shaped Luke into the person he is, and it's a classic and evocative way of passing the torch. For storytelling purposes, I'm okay with it. In-universe, I'm iffy on this. Side note, I know why Lucas made the change from Sebastian Shaw to Hayden Christensen as a Force ghost, but I find his explanation lacking and it bugs me every time. The other minor issue is purely a nitpick, also in regards to the special edition changes. Vader's actions on the Death Star saving his son in silence is far more effective to me than him shouting out no. Partly because I think the line reading we have is too monotone and screams of a lazy take, but also because I was never a big fan of the scene in Revenge of the Sith where Vader screams no in response to Padme's death, and it's an uncomfortable reminder of an unintentionally funny and hammy moment. Now, those are just small and largely inconsequential problems. Otherwise, the arc with Vader and Luke is one of my favorite elements from any of these films. I also have to give special credit to Ian McDiarmid here. The Emperor is perhaps more campy and reminiscent of a cartoon devil caricature than I would like, but Ian goes back and forth between entertaining scene-chewing and genuinely creepy. It's a skill with this role that I think only he can pull off, and I commend him for that. The Emperor was name-dropped in Episode 4, he appears briefly in Episode 5, but this feels like the main event, and it was worth the wait. Plus, as always, John Williams turns in fantastic themes for this series, and the Emperor's theme is one of the most quintessentially Star Wars-y bits of music ever. It feels like the embodiment of all the dark dread and reveling and evil that the Emperor is supposed to represent. Whenever this theme crops back up in any of the episodes, I get a grin on my face. While Luke and Vader appropriately get the most focus, the other main characters are left a bit lacking. Harrison Ford notoriously asked for Han Solo to be killed off. It's been said it was because he was fed up with the series and wanted out. However, Harrison talks about it being more about Han serving a purpose in the story, and I think I understand what he's getting at. After Han's rescue at the beginning, where he understandably can't play an active role, Han leads the ground team, but this role could have been done by anyone, and I think the result would have been the same. Becoming a rebellion general is a natural place for Han to progress to, but Episode 6 relegates him to the guy in charge of the ground mission for 2 acts. I have a hard time seeing this as a role that's enhanced by having Han play it versus anyone else. Leia could have effectively performed all of Han's duties, or Lando could have been the one on the ground and Han flying the Falcon, and it wouldn't make much difference to the story. If Han died, it would enhance the emotional stakes of this episode and remind us of the difficulty of this fight. We've experienced wonderful victories and incredible losses in our struggle to bring down this evil. The final battle would now be one that we'd have even more investment in if we felt it was being waged in part because of the loss of Han, a beloved part of the last 2 films. In my opinion, the character would have done a bigger service to the story in a dramatic sense with his death. Both Lawrence Kasdan and Richard Marquand were pushing for something like this during the script writing stage, but Lucas was the holdout because he wanted a clean, happy ending. Well, the creator got what he wanted. Despite this misstep in my view, Harrison is always a joy in this role, and it did allow for him to be part of any further adventures on screen or in print. But in my mind, a far greater injustice was done to Leia. I've said before that her best role was in the first film. I do love her in Empire 2, and it was only once the trilogy was wrapped up that I have a slight issue with it in context. But in film 3, Leia has a similar problem to Han in that there's little she does in the story that's unique to her character. She goes to Endor because she asks to go. She's not there because her skill set demands her presence. She does fine in the first act, but then she gets stripped down and chained up. I do love her killing Jabba though. All things considered, and despite her participation in the battles, she comes across very passive in this film. There's little payoff or continuation to her subversion of the damsel in distress idea from the original film. The 2 best things with her are her conversation with Luke in the Ewok village and the wrap-up to her love story with Han. These are great to have, and they do help in a small way. I think her part in this film stands out more because her being the other doesn't really matter here. It just resolves a dangling plot thread. There's no impact on the events beyond being a motivation for Luke at the end. I imagine this was pretty disappointing to fans who spent 3 years speculating about the existence of the other before the release of the film. When he sold his ideas to Disney in 2012, Lucas's outline for the sequel trilogy would have had Leia become the chosen one in place of Anakin, which would have helped resolve part of this problem, as the 9 episodes would be one ongoing story, and I could forgive this film for not doing much with it. Considering the sequel trilogy we got, at least Leia gets something to do in Episode 9, but it certainly doesn't capitalize on her character the same way Episodes 7 and 8 did with Han and Luke respectively. And so that's still a problem with the series overall. And if memory serves, the Colin Trevorrow script for Episode 9 called Duel of the Fates really didn't fix this issue either. So maybe Leia was kind of screwed anyways once Lucas left the series. In summary, I believe Leia is the most shafted of the original trio. Lando participating in the final battle and leading the fight in the skies above Endor is a great idea. I'm glad he wasn't pushed to the side here, and it's nice to see him as the responsible leader who's making good of his second chance that he was given at the end of Empire. That said, I wish he had more of an opportunity to flesh out his personality and give him a good character building scene like the ones we got in the last film. But the film as is a bit overstuffed with players, and I imagine he got lost in the shuffle. I do appreciate giving a little time for both Yoda and Obi-Wan, as their scenes are some of my favorites in the series. I applaud 3PO getting more to do this time. I think this is the first time in the films where his fluency in language is given more prominence in the story at multiple key points, and it leads to some endearing comedic levity as well as making 3PO feel useful. Perhaps the biggest new character beyond the Emperor in this film is Jabba the Hutt. I'll get to what I think about the opening in a second, but Jabba is such a memorable character. Slimy in every sense of the word. He's a lot of fun to watch on screen, and I marvel at the puppetry that brings him to life. It's a good example of the magic of Star Wars, where the technical wizardry is done so well and married to the story that I just believe in the world and characters. It's no wonder his shadow loomed large on subsequent Star Wars stories that deal with the criminal underworld in general, and the ones that go to Tatooine specifically. The opening on Tatooine has been criticized by some for being too long and having no real connection to the other two acts. I do think that's a problem on paper, especially since film real estate across 2 hours is precious. Though I don't think this film would have been harmed by a longer runtime and may be justified as being the end of this trilogy for being the longest chapter. But taken on its own, I love a lot about the first act. I love how it fleshes out an aspect of the universe we've only touched on in previous films. I love the creativity on display with all these aliens and creatures. There are quite a few memorable characters. Both the Rancor and Sarlacc are solid action scenes, and there's a great atmosphere about Jabba's palace. Luke's plan seems a little convoluted, but I think the original idea behind it that Lucas had is great. Luke crafted a plan that went in stages, and each stage had a chance of succeeding on their own. But if all the plans failed, everybody would now be in place for the final battle above the Sarlacc, and it would be much easier to fight their way out over the Sarlacc than in the cloistered halls of the palace. Granted, none of this is said in film, and since this viewpoint comes from an external source, I maybe shouldn't even count it. Still, I find the first act to be an incredibly entertaining part of the film. Equal praise goes to the dogfight surrounding the Death Star at the end. These are some of the most impressive visual effects ever done by ILM, and it's an excellent example of how to do a final battle that builds on top of each other and tells a story versus disconnected scenes of action. Personally, I would say this is right next to the climax of the original film as my favorite space battle in the series. I also love the speeder bike chase. The effects are starting to show their age here, but it's natural that a 40-year-old film would at some point start aging, and the whole scene screams cool to me. Too bad I don't think we've gotten a great version of using speeder bikes in the video games apart from the arcade interpretations. While we're on Endor, let's touch on one of the more criticized aspects of the film, the Ewoks. I love the idea of nature over technology in the final fight, I love the visuals of tree houses occupied by tribes, and there's some fine moments in the final battle. There are a few bits of outright goofiness that I think are a little out of touch with the rest of the battle, and I too have a hard time not wondering what purpose the Stormtrooper armor serves if Ewoks can take them down with arrows and rocks. But honestly, I can live with all of that. What I have the most trouble with is their design. Endor was inspired by a section in the very first script for Star Wars that had Wookiees in a forest battle. Cutting them in size, calling them Ewoks, and making them look like teddy bears is quite lame to me. I understand if you don't want to do Wookiees because you had so much trouble finding someone of appropriate height for Chewbacca in the original film. But can you not make them look so cute? It takes me out of the drama of the finale when I'm cutting back to things that are about as threatening as my Cavapoo. The production is top-notch here, as you would expect. If there's one thing I think improves substantially as the trilogy progresses, it's the visuals. Compare the final battle in the original film versus what they do here, and it's nothing short of astounding. The score is another place where I have nothing but love. Speaking from a pure enjoyment bias, the original trilogy's music is a plateau of awesomeness and quality level. All three films have earned their accolades in this department, and if Williams was never brought back for any of the subsequent films, I think it would be the most justified backlash in the history of backlashes. There are too many great pieces to name here. The Emperor's music, as I mentioned earlier, Jabba's theme, the Ewok melody, the build-up to the Battle of Endor, the choral music when Luke attacks Vader, Vader's sacrifice and later death. It's all fantastic. Two more things before I close. First, the special edition changes. I think I made my viewpoint pretty clear on the existence of the special editions with the other reviews, so I won't repeat myself here. However, this film had some pretty divisive changes, and most of them were for things that didn't need changing. But hey, that's pretty on brand for Lucas, isn't it? The Jedi rock song sequence is fine, I guess. I mean, I prefer the original version, but an over-the-top musical number is very 1930s, just like the film serial format that Lucas was going for with this series. And he did end up doing a similar thing in the Temple of Doom a year later. I do think you overdid it on this one, George. I have no opinion on the Sarlacc beak, though I think it should be noted that most of the depictions of the Sarlacc afterwards have omitted the beak, so that should tell you how esteemed it was with fans and filmmakers apart from Lucas. The blinking eyes on the Ewoks is strange, but Lucas did indeed try to have them in the original version, so I give that one a pass. I've already covered the Vader No and the Hayden cameos, which are my two big bugbears, so that just leaves the finale. I like having additional shots of other planets so as to emphasize how much of a galactic celebration the Alliance victory is, though it feels a bit premature because the Battle of Endor isn't actually the end of the Empire in either timeline. But that's not the movie's fault, and Lucas had intended the story to end here. Also, I know old school fans love the Yub Nub song, and it is great, but I prefer and adore the victory celebration music from the new version. I think it works much better as a celebration for the story so far and gets me more emotional. The other thing I wanted to bring up was something I think got its start in this film: repetition. One of the major criticisms of the movie was that on the surface it felt like a remake of the original. Sure, the actual plot is different, but we return to Tatooine and encounter a variety of aliens within the criminal underworld, complete with a musical performance. We have another Death Star that gets destroyed in a big space battle where the rebels are the desperate underdog. The ships go down a corridor to shoot at a particular target, which begins the chain reaction to blow it up. And that final battle once again symbolizes the beginning of the end of the Empire's reign of tyranny. Star Wars has since had a problem of repetition in a lot of subsequent media. The original Knights of the Old Republic copies a good chunk of its thematic beats from the original films, right down to the final battle to destroy the big Doomsday weapon, and has so many visual similarities that it honestly feels like a redo of the original trilogy at times. The prequel trilogy evokes a lot from the original films with its elements, with Episode 1 being the biggest culprit in my book. The sequels are intentionally resembling these films, sometimes creating major problems for their stories. And I can't tell you how many times across the various books, comics, TV shows, and video games I've had to hear "I've got a bad feeling about this" and other infamous lines from the original trilogy. Maybe it was because I lived in a world where Star Wars ripping off of Star Wars was natural, but I've grown to accept it as a feature of the series that I have to learn to live with. I'm far more impressed with the projects that do their best to stay away from the nostalgia baiting of these references, and I wish the series itself would move further from the original trilogy. But I'm not as harsh about it showing up as I probably should be, because there's a lot of projects that I like in spite of the references. My stance is, if you're going to repeat something, either do it with enough differences that it feels like an interesting parallel to what came before, or execute the repeat well enough that I don't care that I've seen it before. But this is just me, and I certainly can't fault you if repetition of story elements in a franchise is one of your pet peeves. I think it's perfectly valid to call out the lack of originality with repetition, and it's certainly not ideal if you want a universe that feels expansive. But I've seen repetition done in ways that enhance my appreciation of the work, though, so I'm not fundamentally opposed to the idea. However, I hate seeing how blockbuster filmmaking has used it as a crutch since the inception of Hollywood, but that's a story for another time. To quote Roger Ebert, Return of the Jedi is magnificent fun. The stuff I love here is just as strong or stronger than the rest of the series has managed. It's the least of the trilogy because I think it fails to take full advantage of some of its parts. Return of the Jedi has all the pieces in place to be the undisputed king of the series, but the missteps I feel it makes brings it under its two predecessors. But hey, third place in the original trilogy still puts it heads and shoulders over most of the Star Wars films, shows, and projects that came afterwards. And if nothing else, Lucas's happy ending does its job. I do finish the film with a smile on my face, wondering about the adventures that obviously will come later for this group of heroes, but satisfied for the here and now. For Lucas and certain fans, I imagine this film represents a bittersweet end of an era. I know for some they'd prefer to believe nothing more happened after this film, but alas, evil never stays buried for long. Luke, Han, and Leia's story doesn't end here. They would go on to continue the fight with the remnants of the Empire in the subsequent years. They would establish a new government and a new Jedi Order, and they would risk losing everything in the face of a re-emergent evil. But they will not be doing it alone. On the whole, I think the praise for the original Star Wars trilogy is well-deserved. Even if it doesn't quite earn the title of Best Film Trilogy in my book, it's still pretty close. Through these 3 films, we were introduced to a universe that reeled us in, hook, line, and sinker. The fact that the world has seemed to be obsessed with Star Wars for the last 50 years is a testament to the enduring popularity and quality of these 3 films. The trilogy changed movie making as we know it. It propelled nearly all the key players involved in it to being household names, and it inspired many follow-up stories in nearly every medium. And somehow, the varying quality of the follow-ups has not seemed to diminish our appreciation of the trilogy, and I think it's because it's so dear to so many of us, often inspiring people to pursue careers in filmmaking and leaving their mark with subsequent popular works. Honestly, the biggest problem I have with the trilogy isn't even its fault. Because of their revered status, it seems like this universe just can't get away from these films. I've seen several other franchises have this problem. The original classics serve as the blueprint and inspiration for almost everything else in the franchise, to the point where we seem chained by them. Even Lucas's own prequels, one of the efforts that most tries to get away from the original trilogy in style and aesthetic, are so defined by them that Lucas himself can't resist from putting in countless echoes, similar scenes, and throwing in unnecessary cameos or nods. He may define it as poetry that rhymes, but it can feel like we've run out of ideas for the series. And yet, that doesn't stop subsequent creators from trying, and I'm grateful for that. There are a few fantastic efforts that nearly match or surpass the original trilogy for me, and I'm not surprised there aren't more. The original trilogy had a singularly rare effect on people that's nearly impossible to describe. If I knew how to, I'd be doing it myself, and would have a hard time understanding why so many movies and shows, including those completely unrelated to Star Wars, aren't able to replicate the magic. Still, the original Star Wars trilogy is one of the most universal projects to come out of cinema in appeal, and I delight in returning to this universe, even if I know in my heart that the bar these 3 films set for the series is perhaps higher than any reasonable expectation should have it be. But if it inspires us to keep trying, then perhaps it's tapping into something that the trilogy tries to teach us. Hope is a powerful motivator, and it is what sustains us through the long and difficult battles we take part in our daily lives. As long as we never lose sight of that hope, defeat becomes a stepping stone to victory.